My name's Kylie Sproston. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Bellberry. Bellberry is a private, independent, not-for-profit organisation founded just over 20 years ago in Adelaide, South Australia. We were founded to provide Australia's first institutionally independent Human Research Ethics Committee service. We've now grown and provide oversight to 40% of Australia's CTN registered clinical trials right way across the country. And we do so as a not-for-profit with two simple objectives. The first being to protect the welfare of human research participants, and the second, kind of broader objective, is to improve the quality, efficiency and effectiveness of research. The Australian environment has a really unique regulatory framework for clinical trials. We have the Clinical Trial Approval Framework operated by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and that's very similar to the US IND process run by the Food and Drug Administration. But in Australia, less than 1% of clinical trials go through that pathway, and the majority are undertaken through the Clinical Trial Notification Scheme. Under the CTN, the responsibility for the review of both the scientific merit of research and also the ethical dimensions, all of that responsibility is delegated to the Human Research Ethics Committee. That's the function of the organisation that I run here at Bellberry, where we provide oversight for a large research portfolio right the way across the country that bridges private, public, academic and government-funded work, predominantly in clinical trials, but also into non-clinical and social and behavioural sciences as well. We had a big year last year. We're responsible for 40% of Australia's CTN trials. The reality is that's research placed at nearly 2,000 research sites across the country, working with more than 7,000 registered research users. 2024 was also a big year for us because it was our 20th anniversary, and I was absolutely delighted to start that year by winning the South Australian Premier's Award for Not-for-Profit of the Year and finishing it by taking out the Telstra Business Award for health.
Telstra Best of Business Awards National Championing Health Award winner is Bellberry.
In a typical year, more than half of all new therapies approved on a global basis have been seen by a Bellberry HREC at some point in their development life cycle. That's an incredible statistic, and it's testament to two things. Firstly, the strength and reputation of the Australian medical research sector. And secondly, the community that I have the privilege to lead at Bellberry, where we have nearly 250 members of staff, HREC reviewers of all categories, and our board, who join together with us to make a difference. And the last word, it's never been more important to tell stories about the value of evidence-based medical research. The medical breakthroughs of the future will only be possible because of volunteers participating in clinical trials today. Bellberry's primary objective is to protect the welfare of human research participants. And so in closing, I want to recognise their contribution. Thank you.
One of the things we've done at Bellberry is reach through the portfolio to actually understand where the source funding is for the research. And so one of the really fascinating things about what we see in this portfolio is that 3/4 of it is the result of inward investment of international research funding. So 3/4 of research trials in early phase, for example, are international sponsors placing research here in Australia. That is an incredible testament to the quality, reputation, and diversity of our healthcare system, the reputation of our researchers, and the strong and stable regulatory environment that we have here. So a Human Research Ethics Committee is a diverse range of backgrounds and skill sets. They're people defined by the National Statement, a regulatory document that's published by our Commonwealth Government. And they're a group of people that come together to review a number of features of research proposals. They look at the scientific merit, the research integrity, the ability of the proposal to actually answer the research question that's been posed. And then they look at a number of ethical dimensions, justice, beneficence and respect. And that's really about how we go about answering the question that's been posed. The Ethics Committee also has a number of other important functions. One is, where appropriate, providing approval to go ahead and undertake research involving humans. But then during the conduct of the study, the committee also has the responsibility for the ongoing oversight, and the responsibility for oversight of safety of those research participants, monitoring the ongoing performance of the study, routine reporting, and any issues arising like safety issues or complaints.
Institutional ethics committees can sometimes have difficulty separating ethical consideration away from governance considerations. Bellberry doesn't have that issue. It needs to reassure itself of the things in the national statement which focus a lot upon the expertise of the individuals undertaking the research and the appropriateness of the environment in which that is being undertaken. The other difference is that Bellberry probably has very high level of ability to call upon specific expertise when it needs to, which, given the complexity of the studies it offers, considers is absolutely essential, but it's not an easy thing to achieve.
Over our 20 years, Bellberry has grown, initially from one Human Research Ethics Committee, now to 12. Those 12 committees are really quite different to institutional committees. For a start, we populate those committees from a community of more than 170 Human Research Ethics Committee members. That community of members has a really incredibly diverse set of skills and expertise that ranges across the broad range of therapeutic areas in which we see research. All of the committees are general to an extent. We don't have specialist committees in terms of phase 1 or oncology. But every committee is actually specifically tailored to the research that comes to that committee. We will appoint members from our community according to the skill sets that are required to review the research that's coming to the committee on that day. So in that way, actually, our committees do become highly specialist. We'll have first-in-human meetings, oncology meetings, social and behavioural science meetings, and so on and so forth, depending the research that we see on a particular week. Research in Australia happens in a really diverse range of settings, and they're broadly represented within the Bellberry research portfolio. Predominantly, the research that we have oversight is based in the private sector. And by private sector, that in itself is incredibly diverse. That can be anything from large private hospitals and private hospital groups that look very similar to our public tertiary hospitals in many ways, through to independent, private, community-based specialist rooms. So, think independent oncologists or cardiologists, and everything in between, primary care clinics, clinical trial networks in the community. So that's the private sector. Within the portfolio, then we also have public institutions, so public tertiary hospitals and publicly based researchers, academic and university-based researchers, and then those based in independent research institutes like the medical research institutes or some of the social sciences research institutes, and then indeed government departments and consultancies that are dealing more with the evaluation of government programs, for example. So the Bellberry research portfolio sits right the way across the country, but as you'll notice, the two predominant jurisdictions are New South Wales and Victoria. There's a couple of reasons behind that. The first is that that's where the population is. It's where large parts of certainly government research funding goes in terms of large universities and public institutes. New South Wales is also weighted within this portfolio because Bellberry was appointed in 2019 as the mandated reviewer for all early phase clinical trials within New South Wales Health. So in the Bellberry portfolio, New South Wales is probably a little heavier than you'd expect if you were to look at the entire research portfolio across the country. The other point that I think is important to mention, though, is that that portfolio also demonstrates research right the way across the country in other states and territories. Not to the same level, but it certainly exists in all states and territories. And that's important. Just as I talked about the diversity of research settings when I was describing where we see research in the private sector, for effective research and for effective clinical trial recruitment, we really need to be taking research into the settings that are convenient and accessible to our research participants. Generally, that's in their own communities, it's close to home. So there's a couple of interesting things going on in the portfolio if we look at the longer term trends. One of those is an increase in the number of public sites represented within the Bellberry portfolio, which increased to 16% in the 2024 report. There's a couple of things driving that. One, of course, is the strength and success of the New South Wales Health Early Phase Clinical Trial Framework, which continues to grow activity in the early phase in New South Wales. The other driver is really broadening of public acceptance of Bellberry HREC reviews. And that's a good thing in terms of facilitating better connection for multi-centre trials that can happen across both public and private sites. The reporting on therapeutic areas is really interesting, I think. The first thing I would say is that it actually shows a really good breadth of research activity across an enormous range of therapeutic areas. Certainly for international sponsors, I think that's one of the attractions of Australia, that they know that they can bring a really diverse set of research programs into Australia and be well met. That said, within the portfolio, the primary category we see and have seen for a long time is oncology. Other disease areas that were strongly represented were areas like neurology, dermatology, haematology, which also can cross over into the oncology space, and then areas like infectious disease. Some of those are very interesting, actually, because infectious disease, for example, is a research area that actually we often see in primary care as opposed to hospital treatment. So even in the therapeutic areas, we see some really interesting stories about where research is based. At the other end of the graph, we're also seeing growth in newer areas of research like addiction therapies and, of course, the class of drugs like the incretins impacting on endocrinology and gastroenterology. Each year, in association with International Clinical Trials Day, Bellberry publishes its annual clinical trial activity report. And this report, we're obviously very proud of the research that we have oversight of, but part of the reason we publish this is that it actually represents a huge amount of activity led by thousands of researchers and thousands of research sites across the country. It also represents tens of thousands, potentially even hundreds of thousands of research participants that have volunteered to take part in research activity, and we think that's really worth recognising. The report itself is available for download from our website, and it contains a huge number of really great stories. There's information here about disease category areas, national spread and distribution. And there's really interesting stories about, for example, the phases of clinical research. This year in 2024, almost half of the research that we saw was first in human or early phase clinical trials. And that really demonstrates Australia's importance in the global life sciences development program. But the report also demonstrated really strong activity across the rest of the development pipeline as well, across phase 2, 3 and post-marketing surveillance. And interestingly, this year the report also showed an increase in non-clinical activity and other activity like social and behavioural science and government evaluations. Lots more stories, and the report's available for download for people to have a look at themselves.